A Conversation with John Conenna is sponsored in part by Venus Travel Incorporated in Chicago, the agency that has served the Chicagoland area for over 55 years, which is still owned and operated since 1968 by the Conenna family. Again, Venus Travel, the premier agency for over 55 years, is a proud sponsor of A Conversation with John Conenna. And now, on to our episode. Good evening and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Tonight, we are thrilled to have on again, our second time here on our podcast, author Doug Feldmann, American author of 13 books, also a professor in the College of Education at Northern Kentucky University. Doug's work has been recognized in multiple time nominations for the Casey Awards and the Seymour Medal from the Society of American Baseball Research. Doug is also a former scout for the Cincinnati Reds, Seattle Mariners, and San Diego Padres. And at the end of this podcast, I'll be mentioning those 13 books. But tonight is something special that Doug has come back on for. It's the book about Mr. Keith Magnuson, The Inspiring Life and Times of a Beloved Chicago Blackhawk. Doug is the author, and of course the foreword in the book is from the former Scooter line with Stan Mikita, Mr. Cliff Coral, and here is the book. And Doug, before I introduce you, this book came out in 2013.
Yes, right about this time, 10 years ago, fall of 2013. Yeah.
Right? And a great book. Doug, now I'll bring you in. I always start it by like this. How you doing, young man, and what's going on?
Well, just raging through another summer with a 9-year-old, just what a 53-year-old needs, but lots of fun, and yeah, just excited for the baseball season, and people are very interested here because the Reds are hot for the first time in many years. So interest is high here. So fine, thank you, John, and yourself.
Yeah, good. Our Chicago teams remind me of like when you take 2 steps forward and we're taking 100 steps backwards between the Cubs and the Sox. My son being a longtime Cub fan, and I like the Chicago White Sox, but that's that toddling town, Chicago, yeah. But really, to start this off tonight, Magnuson, of course, from my era, a beloved figure here in town. How does it start for you to do a book on this, I'd say, popular player that wore the Indian head sweater?
Well, quite an interesting short road, but an interesting one. In my regular job as a college professor, I have to go to conferences and present at conferences, and was at one in Columbus, Ohio, it would have been, 2002, perhaps 2001. There's a speaker up on this panel, the session I attended. His name was Mark Magnuson.
Oh, wow.
And his name, of course, caught my attention, and I cornered him afterwards, and I said, "Oh, I really enjoyed the presentation. By the way, I'm from Chicago. I'm a big Blackhawks fan, wondering if you're in relation to Keith." And he said, "Yes, that's my uncle. That was his uncle, my dad's brother." And Mark's in higher ed. He teaches, I believe he's currently at he's an administrator at a junior college in Minnesota, I believe. But anyway, we developed a friendship, and it was unfortunately about a year or so later when Keith was killed in the car accident. Just before Christmas of 2003. So that gave everyone, not just me, but I mean everyone in the Chicago area, a chance to reflect on Keith's life, and the impact he had not only in hockey but in philanthropic ventures around Chicago.
Right.
And and we can get into this, but just a beloved figure at many levels, not just hockey. So it finally struck me that he had such an impact that people may not be aware of even, that it would make a fine biography, and I was grateful that Triumph Books in Chicago thought as well. And Cliff, as you said, Cliff Coral got on board with the
Yeah,
forward. We'll get into this too. I'm sure Cliff's a longtime friend
sure.
of Keith since they were 10 years old, actually. So it just turned into a wonderful opportunity to remember Keith's impactful life, and the Magnuson family completely behind the project. Wonderful to work with. Keith's grown children, Kevin and Molly, and Keith's widow, Cindy, all very much in favor of this, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that I retain their friendships to this day.
Wow, that is amazing. Yeah. Because I was going to ask you, again, like we'll bring it up later, like in the book Miracle Collapse of the 1969 Cubs. Again, going through this book, and again, the material that you put out in this book was just something. I mean, like, you made it again feel, if anyone saw our part 1 interview of Miracle Collapse, you made it feel like, wow, we were there again, from his growing up in Western Canada, coming to the Chicago Stadium, playing. I've jumped ahead here, playing at the University of Denver, and of course, then he's plays for the championship in the spring of '69, and then the fall of '69. He's on the Chicago Blackhawk roster with Coral, I think, and the other gentleman from the University of Denver was Jimmy Wisty.
Correct.
Yeah, and he had a cup of coffee with the Blackhawks that season too. The stuff from his early days, Doug, that you dug out, because coming out of Western Canada, I mean, was it hard to get the information? Was it all family based coming back to you?
Largely, yeah. And that Western Canada produces some really rough and tumble
Yeah,
players. I mean, I mean, I go into this a little bit early in the book where it's not the climate controlled suburban rinks, where maybe kids play today, even in Canada, kids play today. But out on the ponds where the wind chill's -20, and that's all there is to do is play hockey, at least in the wintertime. And but yes, largely what Keith's family members had to tell me about his growing up, and Cliff Coral helped a lot in this regard, because again, Cliff is about a year older than Keith. So he was a year ahead in those youth leagues around Saskatoon, and was a year ahead of Keith at the University of Denver, and was instrumental, obviously, in Keith going to the University of Denver. So yeah, largely family memories of the Magnuson clan out there and in that part of Canada.
was he growing up, was he as passionate as he was, like, lay it all, was he always that lay it on the line type of player, even in his youth years and in those leagues out in there?
His style of play changed greatly when he came to the Blackhawks. To a certain degree, yes. There were stories, speaking of his childhood, there are stories of him running barefoot down the alleys of Wadena, his little hometown, until he could get his skates on at somebody's house and then make their way to the pond. I mean, he was passionate about playing, like everybody was there. But might be best for later in our conversation. He does transition from being really an offensive minded player to obviously an enforcer.
Right.
But no, always had that passion. He at really no level, maybe except for some time in college, did he display skills that were exceptionally above everybody else, and that includes his youth time. And that now that I think about it, that may have impacted his decision to go to Denver, because, of course, most of the kids in their early teens in Canada whose goal it is to play in the NHL, they'll jump to the juniors as young as they can. The college route for hockey, it's better now, but it was almost non-existent back in Keith's day. And we can talk a little bit more about Murray Armstrong as coach at the University of Denver. But the guys coming out of college really had to prove themselves through the pro scouts, because they were thought of as not being serious even about a pro career. So
You know, that's a great point by you, because now 2023, June 13th, we are now seeing how they're coming out of the colleges. So that was really a rarity to get Coral, Wisty, and Magnuson from the University of Denver. And I remember an article back then, because I was about 9, 10 years old, in the Chicago Tribune, because at the time, the Blackhawks had a general manager there named by the Tommy Ivan, and he had made the ill-fated Phil Esposito trade with Fred Stanfield and Kenny Hodge. And what looked like was in the Blackhawks' favor turns out to be catastrophic in the years to come. And to take now 3 guys from a college, it was like, uh-oh, what are we really now heading in the wrong direction? Did that come up in conversations?
A little bit, yeah. That's a great point. I mean, because like compared to the baseball draft, like the modern version started in 65 with I think Rick Monday being the first choice. And by then, and Rick Monday was a great player in college.
Oh, wow.
And my point is, you know, by then college baseball was well developed. College hockey, not so much by the mid 60s. So it was really a risk. And Tommy Ivan, after they decided to sign Keith, or they wanted to sign Keith, Keith tells a story about being in a hotel room in Denver and being very intimidated by Tommy Ivan, thinking if he made one false gesture or move that his whole pro career would be blown. But you know, it was a great risk by Tommy Ivan, and as you mentioned, Tommy Ivan made questionable moves, but he took a risk that paid off in largely because Murray Armstrong, again at Denver, was a highly regarded hockey man who had come down from Canada, taught the Canadian way of playing. And Cliff Coral mentioned this to me. He said, you know, when they played other colleges, it really, I mean, who were taught, you know, with all due respect, by American coaches who didn't know the deep Canadian hockey way, the more successful hockey way. It showed, especially in the physical side of the game.
Physical, you know, and in the book, in reading the book, I think it's Magnuson himself who says, you know, here they have these stars on this Chicago Blackhawk team about Dennis Hall, Jim Pappin, Makita, Bobby Hall, Chico Mackey, Kenny Warm. He knew that they needed an enforcer. They didn't have that, especially after this 1967 team when they were predicted to win the Stanley Cup. I mean, did Billy Ray give him this role, you think, in 69, 70?
Well, it was an assistant coach, and the name escapes me now, but one of Ray's assistants actually pulled Keith aside before training camp started and told, excuse me, one of his assistant coaches at the University of Denver pulled him aside and said, and it's one of Murray Armstrong's assistants, and the name escapes me, but it kind of changed Keith's career because he said, look, the Blackhawks need this person. They need this type of person. You were a puck mover, as they're called, a puck moving defenseman in college. He put up great points for a limited number of games in the college schedule. So he was an offensive minded defenseman in college. But that totally changed when he came to the Blackhawks. And this coach told him, you know, you go to training camp with the Blackhawks, you know, the first couple of days, it's almost like a prison story. First couple of days, find someone to rough up a little bit. But don't stay away from the superstars. Stay away from the Hulls, from Makita, all those guys happen. Don't go after them. I think it was Eric Nestorenko was the Keith's target, but he laid him a good one in the corners and it got people's attention. And Keith said to himself, Keith noticed that people noticed what he was doing. And he said to himself, hey, I may not be the most physically gifted guy out here, but nobody's going to outwork me and I'm going to make this team. And that's what happened.
Wow, I mean, that's a tremendous thing because Nestorenko was a big guy. I still remember him, number 15, and he had the big elbows, like he would throw them around like Gordie Howe did back in the day. Sure. So your depiction of this coming to Chicago, was it, let alone him and Coral and of course Wisty, and of course that year they pick up Esposito for $25,000 in this waiver draft. So now they really pick up 4 solid players. Was he nervous about coming to Chicago when you talked to the family and the missus and everybody else?
Oh, of course. He was a babe in the woods. He, again, after his Tommy Ivan negotiation, he wanted to behave himself as much as possible. So I think that changed over the years, but what I mean in an innocent way, like later on, he and Cliff Coral would get into shenanigans off the ice, very minor things, but no, for the most part, he just laid very low, just they stayed in the one of the big skyscraping hotels downtown during training camp in 69, fall of 69.
I think it's the Bismarck, maybe.
Bismarck, correct.
Yeah, the Bismarck Hotel. Yeah, yeah.
That's correct. And which, and on an aside, the cook at the Bismarck, may I mention this?
Yeah, no, please. Yeah.
The cook at the Bismarck coffee shop or restaurant, if you will, at the time was a man named John Wayne Gacy.
Oh, Jesus.
And Cliff told me that story. They didn't find out, they didn't realize till years later that he was the chef there, or chef or cook. But anyway, so that was John Wayne Gacy was cooking their training camp meals.
Oh gosh.
But anyway, no, Keith didn't venture out to the nightclub so much or the restaurant so much. He just wanted to focus on starting his pro career. Again, he said, I'm going to outwork everyone that comes my way, and that's why I'm going to make this team.
You know, instantaneously, Doug, he became, I mean, right from the get-go of an exhibition game in 69-70, that was his rookie season here, instantaneously, he became, you know, here, I can still remember him coming out behind Esposito, and, you know, Esposito would come out first and cut up the crease, and he'd race around at 100 miles an hour coming out from the steps at the old stadium. But instantaneously, he became this popular figure. But it was from 69-70 to 1980 that he kept, if he had knee injuries, back injuries, and he had many injuries, as I read in the book, but he kept the fan like saying, wow, Magnuson, the way he came out was ready to play. Was that something too? He just wanted to keep this fire going.
Yes. That's one of the great memories I think people have at the stadium of Keith was, you know, he'd always be the first one out after Esposito and do laps around everyone. And if you remember Darcy Rhoda from the Blackhawk at that time,
number 18.
He told me, and Darcy's a great guy, and he told me this in great respect for Keith, lovingly. He said, you know, that's the fastest Keith ever skated. And when Keith shot the puck, he said it went by so slowly you could read the label on the puck as it went by you. So he meant that lovingly. But no, again, and this plays actually until when Keith becomes a coach of the Blackhawks for a brief time.
Right.
Comes into play negatively, unfortunately, down the road, is his passion for the game. He maintains it to a remarkable level, as you say, through a broken jaw, from a cheap hit by Brian Watson to the numerous fights. You know, he was a lone enforcer on the Blackhawks for several years, with other teams having 2 or 3 or 4 fighters they had to take on every night. So, but he always said, and it comes from that Keanu Reeves Little League movie, The Line. But Keith coined it before Keanu Reeves. He said, you know, one of the most important things in life is showing up.
Right.
And that means for fights in hockey too. Keith will admittedly say, you know, his record in fights was probably 2-92 or something like that. He lost more than he says. I probably won more than I lost, but everyone else says no. You know, Cliff says no. He lost pretty much all of them. But the fact he was there, the fact he was the fighter, the fact he, as Mark Magnuson, his nephew, said, the fact that I'll fight these other guys so you don't have to. He's in essence saying to his teammates, you know, that counts for a lot on a hockey team. It really does. And you know, so I ask you know, your listeners, why would someone who played 10 years, was injured a lot, didn't play, you know, full 80 games or 78 games, whatever, hardly ever, put up a very modest number of points, pretty decent plus minus record. Why would somebody be so well remembered and so loved and be the captain of the team and be a person whom Pat Foley says the greatest captain the Blackhawks have ever had, with no disrespect to Jonathan Toews and the other great ones.
Right, all the other ones, sure.
Why would this person be so revered? And that was part of what kept me digging through the research process. Was What made this guy tick? What made him so special?
And like you just said, to go out every night and to play that physical style every night. And that was the era of hockey where you had to have the enforcer. And then in 1973, he gets a little help because Phil Russell comes to Chicago, and Phil, has to take on a few guys, but I felt like Phil was a little bit more skilled than Maggie. But
yeah, sure.
just those, but I have to say this to you, Doug, from 69 to about 74, it's safe to say that Maggie's pretty solid, don't you think? Before I think we start to see where the injuries now caught up with him and everything else. One thing that, of course, is special to me about your book, there's a chapter in there, and I think me and you have dabbled on it a couple of times through phone conversations. And of course, when we did Miracle Collapse, the chapter, of course, is something that haunts me still. It's the chapter One Win Away, May 18th, 1971, a very, very humid, hot night in the old building in the old Chicago Stadium. And did he touch on that with his family? Because that game is, I want that game to be replayed right now, Doug.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. No, it haunted Keith forever. And that's no overstatement. Yeah, what a scene. Yeah, it's I don't know if the Cubs were in town or not, but yeah, May of 71, there were tornado sirens blowing
Yes.
not too far from the stadium, an incredibly hot, humid day with thunderstorms in the area. And as you recall, as people may recall, a fog over the ice, which played into the Canadians' either first or second goal. Jacques Lemaire, flipped one from center ice, and Esposito said he never saw it, and it went in from 100 feet away. But the picture of Keith, with his face in his hands in the locker room, afterwards, after Game 7, it was just heartbreaking because he felt responsible. When Yvon Cornwallis, jumped over the bench, took a pass, and the few interviews I've seen Keith give about that specific event, he says the same thing over and over. He says, "I should have tripped him. I should have done something other than what I did." And he blames himself, but that's what a team player does. A team player unfairly puts blame on himself for it's always a team loss or a team win. But no doubt haunted him. In fact, in the book, I tell an instance when Cliff backed this up, where not too long after, he suffered one of his first knee injuries, and Cliff took him out and for a bite to eat, and somebody in the restaurant started giving Maggie a hard time about the 71 final. And Keith was there in his cast with his surgery just having been performed, sitting there in a cast, and he just had to sit there and take it. He couldn't even stand up and talk to the guy face to face. And finally, he's out in an alley bawling his eyes out, not just over his injury, but again over the 71 loss. And
the 71 loss, yeah.
I had to take him home and say back to the apartment and to say, it's just this is just a short moment in time. It's hard to see, the big picture down the road, but this will fade. All things with time. And so, but it no doubt, I dare say to his dying day, haunted him to a certain degree.
And I'm sure, yeah, and
faultlessly, without fault. He blamed himself, but it's not fair to blame himself on that.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a team loss. Could Tony have stopped that shot? Who coughed up the puck? We are playing a team game, so we can go back and look at everything. In doing the research, how was he off the ice? I did run into him a few times, especially in the old Chicago State when I would go to games as an early 20-year-old. He was there. He was always there. He would be walking in the lobby, in the halls, and in the balcony. In the mezzanine levels. You could see him walking around. And I noticed one thing about him. If it was the average Joe like me, or if John Beliveau was in the building of the Montreal Canadiens, he's going up to you. If you say, I went up to one time, Mr. Magnuson, he would shake your hand and give you that 1-2 minute conversation. What did his family say? How was he off the ice? I don't see him being this guy who wanted to fight you.
No, really a Jekyll and Hyde character. Loving family man off the ice, successful businessman. ran the Blackhawks Alumni Association
Alumni.
for many years. He and Cliff did together, but Keith was president for many years. He loved growing the Blackhawks name, fan base, just as you say, talking to people about the game, about the Hawks, in business but true to his hockey identity, was never outworked in the business world. I'm laughing because Kevin Magnuson, his son, tells me a story of when each time he and Molly would tag along with him. Keith was in charge for a while of the Chicago area, Seven Up distributor.
7-Up.
And they go into a Jewel or a Dominic's with Keith, their father, and you go, of course, immediately to the soda aisle, and he had to make sure that the 7-Eleven or 7-Up boxes were stacked just so, and displayed just right. And
Right, the displays.
Kevin says he'll always remember that. Just, his attention to detail, engaging is another word that comes to mind, John, when you say, he'd greet everyone. If you see old videos of Keith doing autograph sessions, and there are many of them, or at least several you can find, he's always laughing. He's always having a good time. He's not there just shuffling off a name into the next person. He's taking a moment with each person. He's hugging and laughing the kids. He type of person who would have been successful in any walk of life, but fortunately we had him for hockey in Chicago for 10 years or more. And
sure. Doug, again, just by you saying that, and you've been around the professional baseball world, I've always told my wife, or even good friends of mine, God, if I was a professional, or if I was in a restaurant and let's say it was Doug Feldmann was the average guy, and he came up to me to sign an autograph, and I would sit there and sign all day, and my family has warned me. They says, if you were famous, I think maybe you'd get tired of that. You'd get tired of that because, your privacy is being interrupted. But, a guy like Magnuson, I don't see anymore in today's environment, where you go to a ball game and you're yelling out, Mr. Votto, Mr. Votto, Joey Votto, Joey Votto. And you're hoping that he even just turns around to crack you a smile. That era of Magnuson you think is gone?
Not necessarily. You mentioned Joey Votto. I was just speaking the other day about him. He, as an example of this, with all the young new players on the Reds this year, he's really not just taking them under his wing, but showing them, hey, the first thing you do as a major leaguer, you take care of the clubhouse attendants because they're going to take care of you all year. That sort of mindset. And Magnuson was the same way in the Blackhawks. He brought the young players in, showed them how to be a pro, showed them how to be an NHL player in demeanor as well as skill. Absolutely. I mean, I've had another point to make there with.
I know you brought up Votto for a minute. Yeah.
Oh yeah, just you mentioned is that type of player gone? I don't think so. A lot has to do with a simple personality. I mean,
sure.
Bob Gibson.
Oh,
I mean, a very nice man, but don't you dare go ask him for an autograph while he's having dinner with his wife. I mean,
yeah.
And some people, he is a person who really valued his privacy. If you don't value your privacy so much, obviously your family has to make concessions. Cindy had to make those types of concessions when Keith wanted to greet everyone on the street. So I guess it's a trade-off, and I think it's more personality based than it is era based.
Era based, yeah.
But I think a lot of the wow factor has gone away for people in terms of interacting with,
sure,
because of Twitter and all the stuff. But
all the other stuff that comes with it. Yeah.
When we were kids, we go to a game and we'd see Bill Madlock in person for the first time. Oh, wow,
right.
So yeah, I think it's more era based than it is actually, or personality based than era based. But certainly things have changed. Yeah.
To get back to Maggie and his career, of course, we knew how he was as the player, just heart and soul out there. He would block a shot with his head. He would slide across the ice, fight the Dave Schultz or the Don Selesky of the Philadelphia Flyers. He would do anything. Was it his idea? Did he go up to management, Doug, or did the Chicago Blackhawks approach him in that 79-80 season when he became the interim coach?
They approached him, and to backtrack a little bit, I always wondered why in that last season, or maybe it was the last 2 seasons, I wondered why Keith started wearing a helmet. This rough and tumble player, all of a sudden he starts wearing a helmet.
Right.
And Kevin told me Cindy made him do it.
Okay.
She was worried about all the wear and tear on his body, and Keith's wife Cindy made him wear a helmet. So there was that. And then I believe it was 3 or 4 games into the 79-80 season that Keith tried one last fight. I believe it was Stan Jonathan of the Boston Bruins.
Oh yeah, tough guy. Woohoo!
Yeah, oh yeah, and a little guy, but very tough.
Yeah.
And Keith's knees were just buckling, literally buckling. That was it.
Sure.
That was it for his knees. He just couldn't do it. And that's when he left the ice. He basically went upstairs and said, "I can't do this anymore." And that's when the idea came to I don't know if it was Bill Wirtz or whoever it was, that he'd make a fine
Yeah, I
addition.
think it might have been Wirtz and Bob Pulford at that time who was running the club as the general manager. Yeah, because I always wondered about that, because I'm sure he was the type, hey, let's let's put a fire under these guys, because he had that personality. But you're saying that the Blackhawks did definitely approach him.
Yes, and then the problem was, as I alluded to earlier, and Kevin, his son, confirmed this because I wondered about this. One reason, and Keith made mistakes as a coach too, but the reason why his coaching tenure was not so successful and not so long term is because the young players that were coming up at the time didn't embrace that old school mentality that he had of 100% hustle all the time. May have been bad timing, but a different roster may have served him better. And he was a rookie coach making mistakes, so he probably would have been a better coach at another time. But yeah, management approached him, and he had all the qualifications on paper and off to do it. But I think Keith wanted to break away from direct involvement with hockey and the Blackhawks when he saw that young player, at least the young players they had at the time, a good deal of them weren't embracing that old school mentality.
Yeah, they weren't the type, and I'm with you 100% that we're laying it on the line. And of course, now the era of the game starts to change, and I'm sure they looked at him and says, well, wait a minute. If you're 36, 37-year-old, you get a veteran coming in, like say maybe a Tom Lysiak who's 31, 32. And he says, not that Lysiak would have said something, but now they're saying, I'm going to listen to you. Good. I'm hoping that wasn't the case, but instead of looking at a veteran coach like a Billy Ray or something like that. Right.
It was just a rough transition. I mean, by rough, I mean edgy transition for Keith from player to coach. It wasn't as smooth as he would have liked. It wasn't as smooth as the organization would have liked. Didn't lessen anyone's love for Keith. It just probably wasn't a good fit at the time.
Good fit, right. I mean, and we could talk about a guy named Wayne Gretzky. I don't think Wayne Gretzky was a great coach either, but of course we know he was probably the number 1 or number 2 player in the world. But for coaching, I think Wayne probably, didn't see the ice like he saw it as a player.
That's very true.
I
got a buddy who's a minor league pitcher. He hated having catchers as his pitching coaches because, hey, catchers have never been on the mound. They don't know how it feels to be out there with the ball. So,
Right.
People have all kinds of reasons for, why this relationship or that didn't work out with coaches and players. But it just it wasn't a good fit, and Keith moved on to other things.
Yeah. Doug, I got to ask you, because for me, it was kind of a surprise. It's nothing about inside the book, but are you surprised that the Blackhawks retire his number? When we compare it to the guys that are up there, we talk about Bobby Hull, we talk about Makita, we talk about Dennis Savard, we talk about the great Pierre Pilote, Tony Esposito, Glenn Hall, and all of a sudden now Maggie's number, which was the same as Pilote's. I guess he's up there for this heart, the soul, the desire, just to excel at what he could do to show the athlete of today that, this is what I was about. Were you surprised, even you being the author of this book, that he's in the Raptor?
A great question, John. I really wasn't. You look at his numbers. it would be a surprise to someone who didn't know him, but I think it's a combination of a lot of things. His heart, his desire, of course, Blackhawk fans remember that. He was a two-time All-Star.
Yes.
Not a lot, but I mean, he was a solid player. I think his death moved that along, and what I mean is, you know, we have until recently, of course, with the Hulls and Makitas, and
Yeah.
you know, we have the luxury, so to speak, of seeing former players and engaging them.
Sure.
We lost that with Maggie when we lost him. We no longer had the chance to see his smiling face on the street, and so I think that nudged it along as well. And sharing it with Palat, I think, was a nice gesture on the Blackhawks'
Yes.
part. But I can't think of anyone more deserving, and it does show the intangibles, how the intangibles can impact not just a hockey team or you know, teammates, but a whole community, also a city.
Right. And, you know, I like what you said, and you bring it out also in the book too. I mean, even after life after hockey, he was always giving back to hockey. Like I said, with the alumni thing. And of course, I do see Cliff Coral from time to time because I'm a member of AHI here in the state of Illinois. I'm on a suspension review board here after all the years I coached hockey here in the state. So, yeah, I mean, he did give back his time and everything else. And I mean, I'm still thinking if he was living, he'd be walking in the United Center, and he probably would be. I think if he was alive, he probably would have been one of the ambassadors along with Makita, Hall, and of course Dennis Savard and Glenn Hall. I think I could see him being one of the ambassadors, you know.
No doubt.
Over the 10-year period that this book has been out, and again, I want to hold the book up again, Doug, because this is a fantastic read. And for anyone who has not gotten this book, I had bought this book about 7 years ago and reached out to Doug Feldmann about another book that I have here in front of me, Miracle Collapse. I got to tell you, Doug, the back of this is beautiful, just beautiful, because when I look at that picture of him, that was Magnuson. You know, ready to go out for probably the second period, taping up the ankles. He probably had a broken ankle. Maybe that's why he's taping that one. But this is a great read. The question I have for you before I let you go, how has the book done over its period? Because I love it. I mean, I can go back. I'll be sitting up at night and I go back to a chapter and read it and try to remember some. How's it done for you in the 10 years? Because you did a marvelous job.
Oh, well, thank you again, John. You know, it's hard for anyone to make a living at nonfiction. It's a standby line I have. And I don't, I mean, I can't quit my day job. I don't write books for the money or the sales.
Right.
It's akin to teaching in the education business. And when, you know, a student reaches back to me, a former student says there's really an impact, like you're saying with the book, I'm deeply grateful that I've touched somebody with it. I still get notes regularly. I mean, maybe not every week, but several times a month or a few times a month on, you know, someone just picked up the book and then they remembered Maggie working for Coca-Cola or 7-Up. They worked with Maggie, they can't cross paths with him, or they cross paths with him in the NHL Alumni Association. And I'm just grateful that, you know, I can leave behind an artifact that tells this story about somebody who was very important, not just to Chicago, but to the community at large.
Oh, sure. Sure. I mean, it's just, again, you know, some of the, like the chapters, even the way you present the chapters, like the Pioneer in America, Life Without the Golden Jet, Bobby Hull, the New Bullies, the transition of the game, and of course, him being the coach, you know, just, I mean, a phenomenal book that I still think that people should, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of Chicago fans that have this book. And of course, you depict it so well, even with the cover and everything. I want to read something that really touched me. And it was about Cliff Coral, about what he said about his old buddy. Because, I mean, I still see Cliff from time to time. He said his number now is in the rafters at the United Center as a tribute to Maggie, a player, but even more so to him, a person. He wasn't the greatest player ever to hit the ice, though he certainly served his purpose and showed his hard work and dedication. It's the off the ice stuff, all people he touched, from the little kids to senior citizen. That's this thing that people most remember about Keith Magnuson. Doug Feldmann, just, I mean, a beautiful book, and I'm so glad that you wanted to revisit this after 10 years.
My pleasure, John.
Yeah, this is just tremendous. And again, I got to get into those Cardinal books, because maybe one day you're going to say, oh my God, John Conenna bought all 13 of my books. You know?
Well, you'd certainly be the only one.
But I got to tell you, here's another great book for anybody here in Chicago, Miracle Collapse, which we did the interview on. And again, love the front cover of the cat in New York, which turned that whole 69 season around, I thought. And of course, that infamous 1969 picture, which you could have bought for $1 in Old Wrigley Field.
That's right.
This book is fantastic. I would like to tell our audience one thing, Doug, before I let you say something. 13 of the books, fantastic books. We have the Gibson's Last Stand, Dizzy and the Gas House Gang, of course, the great Dizzy Dean. The 1976 Reds, that one really intrigues me, because that's the year when they swept the New York Yankees. A View from Two Benches about the great Bob Thomas here in Chicago. Alberto's St. Louis Cardinals, past and present. Fleet of the Birds, which I think is the 1985 team with one of your favorites, that manager named Whitey Herzog. So, Doug, I truly thank you for tonight, and you are truly an inspiration in all the things that you're done, being a professor, and these books are just something else.
John, you're much too kind, but thank you. You hold those two books up together, and it reminds me to say, you know, if I may close with this, think about the Cubs and the Blackhawks from, you know, late 60s to early 70s. You got two teams that are so close, both not filled, but both possessing Hall of Fame talent, but just couldn't quite make it. You know, it's all about the same time frame too, right about 69 to about 73. You know, very strong. I don't have to tell you that, you know that already. So.
Yeah, you know, and I got to tell you, I had a neighbor friend of mine, his father, who was really into sports. My father wasn't a sport guy. He said in 1969, we had a hangover. By the end of 1970, he says the hangover was over. But in 1971, on that infamous May 18th night, one went away that you print in the Magnuson book. And by the way, I have to tell you before I let you go, you even brought up commercials in the book that are fantastic, like the STP commercial. You even brought up the great Harvey Wittenberg. You even brought up the weather report of that night, because it was going to rain and storm like no other. And of course, I think there's even an old restaurant which was so famous on Ontario and Michigan called Sukasa. You relived that whole WMAQ with Lloyd Pettit.
Well, it's a pleasure just doing that. For any of those books you rambled off, John, doing the research is not work, because I get to go through these old archives and listen to Lloyd Pettit, you know, listen to Jack Brickhouse, listen to Vince Lloyd. You know, when that's the research, it's not work. So I'm glad I could bring that to life for you and anyone who reads reads the books, because that's just a pleasure for me.
Well, listen, here's what I want to do, and I hope we can do another one somewhere down the road here. I want to, one of my 4 pictures are that if I'm having a team, and even in the modern era, would be Seaver, Gibson, Juan Marichal, and the great Bob Gibson would pitch my Game 7. So when I get this book, Gibby's Last Stand, I want to talk about number 45.
Very good. Thank you. And I found that to be a compelling thing to study, because he was trying to hold on to the old game, kind of like Magnuson was in hockey in 1980, trying to hold on to the old game when it was changing all around him and his skills were diminishing. So that was powerful to find out about Gibby's life. Man.
Sure. Doug, again, thank you. And let's definitely get another one down the road. This was truly a pleasure tonight.
Thank you, John. Pleasure for me. I look forward to it. Thanks.
You got it. Good night, everyone, and thank you.